Welcome to our special series of Let's Talk for KubeCon EU, and I'm your host, Swapnil Bhartiya. Equinix Metal is hosting GIFEE Day for KubeCon EU next week. To learn more about this co-hosted event, my next guest is Paul Teich, Director of Infrastructure Product Management at Equinix. Paul, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Paul, let's just refresh the memories of our audience. What is GIFEE and how do you say it? Is it GIFEE, GIFEE?
I think it really depends on who you're talking to. GIPHY is the way I would pronounce it. And I think where we're at now is, 5-6 years into Google starting to deploy new technologies into the general open source industry. A lot of companies have followed suit. So it's not just about Google anymore. A lot of folks donating code, a lot of effort going into the community. So it's kind of got a life of its own.
How has the concept evolved? Because a lot of things have changed in all these years, the way we are building infrastructure. So talk about the evolution and what's new today.
The evolution really began with Google and the other large clouds understanding what they needed to build to enable their business model. But going past that, what was their core value? Okay, so the difference between a piece of code that enables your business that is pre-competitive, it kind of enables a whole new class of business, but you don't necessarily want to keep that private because it's not your core value. And so something like Kubernetes hit the industry as this is something we need to do to run our fleet more efficiently, but everybody it's not really our competitive advantage. Our competitive advantage lies elsewhere. And so to some extent, a lot of these projects are, a rising tide lifts all boats, is maybe an appropriate metaphor. They help everybody without giving away the secret sauce that really makes a cloud company special in their own eyes and the eyes of the customers.
You said pre-competitive, and actually, what you explained is, I think, a typical open source, right? Rising tide lifts all boats. With open source, most of the cases, the code base is same, but companies differentiate themselves depending on what their specialization is. So, can you explain a bit what exactly did you mean by pre-competitive, and how does it kind of fit into this whole open source world where sales teams do compete, but developers and other teams collaborate?
Service is a product. Okay, so where you provide service, the quality of service, is it automated? Is it high touch and you're calling people to talk about things? And so there's a wide continuum of service quality, service levels, of add-on products that use a base product as an enabler, but that's not the finished product, right? So nobody runs Kubernetes to run Kubernetes. You run services in containers, right? And so having more participants in the industry creates better code. More eyes on code creates better code. You work out more of the bugs, you extend some really useful features. And so all of that is before you get to, here's where our service is available. Here's our quality of service. We have 5 nines, 8 nines. Here's who you call if you have trouble. The add-on products that it enables. And so when I say pre-competitive, it's really, it gets back to what's a company's core value proposition. Some companies' core value proposition is making a piece of open source code enterprise class. We've seen that over and over again, where somebody just puts in the time and effort to harden a piece of code that, the cloud has kind of different attitudes about quality. It's not that they don't have quality, it's that how they achieve it is different than what enterprises do. And so being able to have redundancy is different than building a product that's designed to fail less often. And so, as you know, there are quick spin cycles in our industry. And so if a piece of code is going to last more than 2 or 3 years, that's where enterprise hardening comes into the picture. If you know your code base is going to turn over in 18 months, then you're going to count on eventual failure equipment fails, code fails, and you're going to build redundancy into the code that you're writing. It's a qualitatively different way of approaching the problem.
When we do look at if you like infrastructure, when we do look at a lot of companies, especially with open source, you have to strike a balance. You mentioned, that it's service, so balance between the project and the product, balance between open source and your own intellectual properties. When you are not only contributing to a lot of code through CLAs, but also you are exposing your own code base. So how are companies managing to maintain that balance, and what does it really mean for the health of the ecosystem?
I think a lot of companies today, and we're, as you said, several years into this, look at participating in open source as street cred. It's how to indicate that their code base is solid, that the community has looked at it and vetted it. I think that there's been a big shift from proprietary code being perceived as high value to community-driven code being perceived as high value. So that whole intellectual property debate, I think, is a little bit contrived at this point. Companies, well, it's much harder with bits than atoms to protect intellectual property. Software patents have always been kind of an area of dispute in the legal community. But B, we've seen so many examples where open source code is really enterprise hardened better than an individual company can produce. So one of the things we've noticed also in the open source community is the application stack is important. So the concept that you'll write underpinning software and then add value and application layers above it, that's actually a moving target over time. And so now we have layers of open source software that provide different value to different parts of the supply chain. And so, again, going back to, it's that top layer at any given time of application code that customers see and interact with, and the service quality for delivering the entire stack that really make a difference.
I want to go back to GIPHY a bit. Can you also talk about that? What role does hardware play? Because no matter how much we talk about function as service, software as service, serverless, there is a servers running there, and a server means there is hardware. So the more and more the cloud is growing, the more and more data center and hardware will grow. So talk about the role of specialized hardware when we do talk about building Google-like infrastructure.
So the difference in the way hardware and atoms work versus bits is that at the end of the day, somebody has to manufacture atoms. So there's a lot of intellectual property in manufacturing modern chips and modern system design. This is where when we look at what's really open source and what's a de facto standard, like the x86 instruction set, accident of history, it's now a de facto standard. We have ARM intruding into the space. It's also proprietary. It's got a different licensing model behind it, so it's a little bit more widely available. We have something like RISC-V, right? And so there are levels of open in open source. And at RISC-V, although the instruction set itself is open, there's a community of manufacturers designing chips around RISC-V that are for-profit organizations who have to have their chips, for lack of a better word, printed, manufactured somewhere. Okay, and that manufacturing process involves a lot of hard-earned intellectual property. And so for the open source hardware community, what we look for is technologies that companies have amortized already, that they are willing to donate into the open source community, because they weren't community projects. They are de facto industry standards. They are single companies working on technologies to better their business. And like open source software, they've figured out that underlying hardware technology may not be a differentiator for them. It's an enabler, not a differentiator. If they open it up a bit, then they get more industry participation. It helps improve the quality, lower the costs. That part looks the same. But you're depending on now companies that have developed artifacts based on atoms who look at it as uh, to some extent, street cred, participating in the industry. But to another extent, it's probably as profitable or more profitable to let somebody else manufacture it more efficiently.
From Equinix Metals perspective, what are the things about GIPHY that is kind of exciting to you?
We operate data centers at scale, not hyperscale like the large IaaS clouds, but at significant scale. And what we look for are these interesting projects that help us operate our infrastructure more efficiently. So, as you know, Open19 recently joined the Linux Foundation. There, as a top-level hardware project, we're sitting alongside things like OpenBMC, LF Edge, and projects that actually impact our customers in terms of how we deploy infrastructure. So for us, it helps us provide customers with better service, and more focus on areas that they really want to see better performance or higher quality.
So you're hosting GIPHY Day at KubeCon EU. Tell us a bit about the event. What should people expect? What is the theme this year there?
So there's a lot of theme around how open source intersects with the real business world. And for instance, one of the things that we're looking at is how to deploy servers more efficiently. And so Equinix and Equinix Metal have donated Tinkerbell, our provisioning system, to the Linux Foundation. And so that'll be an important theme for us, obviously, but more importantly for other people who want to deploy not just data center equipment, but Tinkerbell can be used to provision Internet of Things and pretty much anything that you want to provision at scale. Data center for everyone else is a concept of operating data centers with some of the scale that a hyperscale operator, one of the big clouds, can provide. But not everybody has their purchasing power. And so a lot of what we're trying to do in the open source community is this whole data center for everyone else, helping to design some of the open source foundations for any company at any scale to get some of the experience of operating a cloud, whether that's private cloud, whether it's managed by somebody else, but making that technology base more widely available, easier to consume.
Paul, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk to us. The floor is all yours if you have any closing thoughts before we wrap this up.
I always enjoy KubeCons, and I'm happy that GIPHY Day is co-located with them virtually. And looking forward to participating in the discussions about deploying infrastructure at scale. I think that's really the theme this year, whether you're talking about farming and Internet of Things, talking about Tinkerbell and deploying images on hardware at scale, or talking about data centers themselves as the subject of open source innovation. It should be exciting. Looking forward to it.